Thank you so much for that introduction, Tom. To those of you who don't know who I am, my name is Zarah Sultana. I'm the Labour Member of Parliament for Coventry South, and I want to thank the Media Democracy Festival, Tom, Rowan, for the invitation to speak today. And like Tom mentioned, I'm going to speak quickly, well, not quickly, but kind of quickly about the role of the media, some examples that I think that really illustrate the way it functions before I conclude about ways that we should perhaps relate to it, and then hopefully some questions. So we're all here today because we recognise the vital role of a well-functioning media. It's foundational to a democratic society, keeping the public informed of pertinent issues, holding the powerful to account, and fostering lively debate. That's what we believe it should be doing. But it's a truism that a well-functioning media is essential to a democratic system. But the problem that we have in our society that we don't actually have a well-functioning media. And this means that our democratic credentials are compromised as well. The facts are well established, and you guys know them just as well as I do. Just 2 billionaires control more than 2/3 of the UK's print newspaper market. Lord Rothermere, owner of the newspapers that include the Mail, the Metro and the Eye, and of course, the one and only Rupert Murdoch, owner of The Sun, which I don't really like using, but as a Liverpool fan, but also as a decent person, and The Times, amongst others. Beyond them, we have billionaire owners of The Telegraph and The Evening Standard. And these very wealthy, excessively wealthy individuals don't just buy up newspapers because they love journalism or it's something to feel good about. It's because it's important, and they even run their newspapers sometimes at a loss. In our country, the richest 1% own more than the combined wealth of the poorest 70%. So we have a system with stark inequalities, and it isn't something that is natural or inevitable. This requires constant work. This requires constant effort to maintain and reproduce itself, and we see that reproduced within our media system. Our billionaire press barons play a very important role in doing just that. And the way that they own and control these papers is something that threatens our democracy. And it's not a conspiracy theory, it's well known and it's on the record. For example, the former editor of the Sunday Times, Harold Evans, told the Leveson inquiry how Rupert Murdoch would rebuke him when he did not, and I quote, do what Murdoch wanted in political terms. So we see a direct instruction within the press of these elite interests. Billionaire ownership doesn't really need to directly control the editorial process to have significant influence. And we see that in the Washington Post and Jeff Bezos. He bought the paper, and it didn't matter how good the scoop was. Editors at the Washington Post were not going to investigate the harsh, brutal conditions at Amazon's warehouses. I guess it's a Freudian slip. No matter how dire the conditions were. So these class interests of these billionaire owners shapes the editorial process, and then it reverberates down the pecking order, influencing who gets hired, what stories get written about. And it's worth noting that these billionaire owners are almost the most reactionary people, and also they are most determined in protecting the status quo. But that's part of the story, because we also have institutions like the BBC, most notably, picked up recently with a tweet where we found that our press, especially the right-wing press in this country, decided to place more attention on the tweets of Gary Lineker, a TV sports presenter, than actually holding the government to account. So we found Gary Lineker was held more accountable than ministers in this country for vile anti-refugee policy. And Tom will tell us more later about the BBC and what we can do there. But we have an extreme version today with people like Richard Sharp at the helm, but bias at the BBC isn't exactly a new phenomenon at the broadcaster. So we have a situation where the government is able to appoint the chairman, controls the purse strings, and then is able to discipline the organisation as a whole. But there's something that the BBC shares also with the rest of the media ecosystem, and that's the character of its leading lights. Nearly half of the UK's 100 most influential editors and broadcasters are privately educated, compared to just 7% of the rest of the public. And these are people who don't need much encouragement to see the world in a particular way. They see it from the perspective of the dominant class, and they already have a shared understanding of politics, how the world works, how it affects them, and the questions that they think are worth asking, stories that they think are important to pursue, and which voices they think are worth listening to. And then we see this directly affecting the underrepresentation of Black and ethnic minority communities, working class stories, stories from trade unions and industrial relations. And this is something that relates to the fact that the social circles that all of these people are operating in, it sets the agenda and the viewpoints that they sympathise with. So, for example, when workers in the West Midlands go on strike against bosses in London, which of the two are journalists most likely to know about? Well, they generally live in the same area, they go to the same Zone 2 dinner parties, and they also have the same kind of schools and connections as each other, bosses, bankers, politicians, all together. And we see a demise of the printed press in this country, and that's often discussed, but neglected is the agenda-setting role of the press, which decides the news of the day and also, the character, class character of the papers that we will continue to discuss in this festival. And I don't want to just say that, there isn't excellent journalists who are publicly minded and who are pursuing the stories that are really important to our communities. But so long as these broader class dynamics exist, there is a huge cost to public discourse that leads to a distorted process of what news matter. And a few examples of that. We could talk about how the media misrepresents left-wing political figures. I think we could talk all day about that one. But there's also the failure to challenge the status quo, or how events like Orgreave and Hillsborough are misrepresented and the working class is demonized. But I want to touch on racism and the media in particular. And in particular, touching on one case study, which is, I want you to think of a hoax that caused a national political scandal. And now this hoax has dominated newspaper front pages for weeks on end, portraying a minority community as the enemy within. So now let's take it to another level. This hoax goes so far that even the government is now using it as a basis for repressive new laws that disproportionately target that minority community. So now some investigative journalists are exposing that this is a hoax, and the politicians that stirred up the hatred knew that it was a hoax all along. You'd think that would be a big deal, people would be outraged, it would be described as a scandal. However, we don't have a well-functioning media system for that to happen, so it wasn't considered a big deal by our media. Because this is what actually happened, and it's the Trojan Horse scandal that I'm referring to, with the release of the New York Times Trojan Horse Affair podcast last year, which investigated the Trojan Horse scandal that rocked British politics in 2014 when I was at university. A letter supposedly detailed a Muslim plot to take over schools in Birmingham with the supposed aim to Islamize classrooms. And the podcast revealed that even before the letter was made public, Michael Gove, who was the education secretary at the time, and he's still a Secretary of State today, was warned by the police that this was in fact a bogus letter, and that's a quote. It was bogus. It was a hoax. And even though he was told this, you'd think that a politician, someone who should subscribe to principles of accountability, trust, and so forth, wouldn't take it a level further. But he acted as if it was a real thing, went to Parliament, raised the alarm about the contents of the letter, prompting this huge bigoted, hysteric response from the right-wing media. You had the Daily Mail, for example, who had a front page describing an Islamist plot to replace teachers in Birmingham with radicals. The Spectator's front page, which I'm sure some of you will remember, had Taught to Hate as its headline, with a picture of a child holding a Quran in one hand and a sword in another. But no evidence of a plot was ever discovered. But the damage was done, and it's still, its legacy is still there today. The scandal mainstreamed Islamophobic ideas about Muslims conspiring to undermine British society, depicting them as an enemy within. And it made its way to government policy with a 2015 counter-extremism strategy repeatedly referencing the scandal. So the podcast that was actually done by, the New York Times, it had a British journalist and an American journalist. Why wasn't that done in this country? Why wasn't that investigation done by British journalists here in the UK by a British publication? Those are the questions that we have to ask. And despite its explosive revelations and its huge popularity, it was met with near silence from our British media. And the journalists and the newspapers that had splashed the stories about these plots were silent. Michael Gove, too, was able to brush it off, and that speaks to a dysfunctional media. It speaks to a media that would not want to hold power to account and truth to power. The episode showed how the right-wing press, alongside right-wing politicians, can whip up hate and fear based on lies, with often very little interest in pursuing the truth at all. And while that's an example of the media stoking up Islamophobia, it's far from unique, because there's the Muslim Council of Britain's Centre for Media Monitoring report last year that published details about how Islamophobia is propagated in our press. They analysed almost 48,000 articles and 5,500 broadcast clips in a single year, spelling out how British Muslims or Muslims are portrayed in the media. And the report is shocking to anyone who wants to read it. It found how articles antagonistic to Muslims outnumber supportive articles to a ratio of 7-1, with 3 in 5 articles identifying negative aspects or behaviours with Muslims or Islam. And beyond this drip feed of hate, the report identifies common tropes about Muslims, identifying, for example, how the British media feeds Islamic-phobic beliefs that Muslims are different and a threat to Britain and the West, how hard-right publications like The Spectator pose tough questions like, can Muslims learn to put country before faith community? The report's conclusion is unavoidable. The British media has an Islamophobia problem, but it also has a racism problem. It also has many different discriminations. I think this is just a tip of the iceberg. And of course, in the recent weeks, months, we've seen how the trans community have also been attacked. We've seen the traveller community targeted, and perhaps at the moment, nothing speaks more to how refugees and migrants are being portrayed and have been portrayed for a very long time. But now I think it is completely undeniable. And at the same time, in this country, we've seen child poverty double. We've seen workers' wages fall at the fastest rate in decades. We've seen the number of people sleeping on our streets increase by more than 25%. The state of our public services continues to crumble. And we've seen workers across the board go on strike. And at the same time, in this country, the richest 177 people have managed to add an extra £55 billion to their fortunes. And instead of portraying those issues or highlighting those issues, the right-wing press choose to use their front pages to tell a different story, drip-feeding hate and fear, focusing people that arrive in this country in dinghies. And they do this deliberately. They do this so these are the issues in the public consciousness. They are able to construct what we see as crises and what become government's priorities. And this happens because their interests are directly linked to this. It's because the right-wing press want to support their friends in the press, in politics, and it's serving a purpose. When living standards are falling and discontent is rising, we know that the classic tactic is to divide and rule, to distract us as well, and pitting us against each other, pretending that the problems in our country are not growing poverty and inequality. And of course, this just wouldn't be possible without newspapers like The Times and The Telegraph playing along and setting the agenda. So what are we going to do about it? Firstly, we just need an honest assessment of what's before us. There are good journalists and there are better and worse publications. But taken as a whole, our media is not a simple, impartial arbitrator of the facts or the truth. It has a class character that is deeply structural. And personally, I don't think it's wise to just cozy up to the Mail or Telegraph, hoping that they'll just put a nice piece out about the causes that we believe in or individuals that are trying to push a good agenda, as if they might be won over And that's just because we're really charming or nice to them. I don't think that's going to happen. But we have to stay true to our politics because they're going to stay true to their hostility. Secondly, if the left really does challenge the right-wing press, it needs to expose it for what it is, whether it's the Sun or the Mail targeting minorities. We need to point out why the billionaire press barons are doing just that. We need to build up an independent media, have our own platforms, engage with the mainstream, but not under any illusions of impartiality. And that is something that we all have to do together: academics, activists, people who are working in the media, people who are operating in spaces outside, in politics. We all have a job to do. Thank you so much. My mouth is dry because I'm fasting, so I'm going to be quiet now. Thank you for those questions. So firstly, with kind of new media and social media, I think social media has really changed the way we get our information, the way we look at politics. I think of the role that, for example, TikTok's played, and I know that that's a controversial one at the moment with the bans in Parliament and elsewhere. In particular, we have to look at Facebook, where it has allowed fake news, it's allowed conspiracy theories, it's allowed far-right politics to spread like wildfire with very little accountability. And we've seen how even in general elections in this country, you have so much dark money being used through Facebook, and there's very little accountability. Personally, I don't think the government has any desire to take on big tech. It is not willing to threaten breaking up the companies. Like sometimes we hear about what's happening in the US, where Facebook and other organizations, in particular TikTok's being brought in front of politicians there with politicians saying that they want to break up the monopolies. I think we need to move towards a system where we are able to have greater accountability of the way hate is used or propagated. But I also find, in particular as a politician, people will look towards the hate that they get via Twitter, via Facebook, and kind of just base it on, oh, we need to get rid of anonymous accounts. And I think that is very, very dangerous, because that doesn't address the fact that what we're seeing on those platforms is structural. It's part of institutions like the press. It's a drip feed process. So I think the way we move forward on social media is legislation that doesn't allow so much dark money to be kind of used through those structures, the kind of presence of the far right. I think we need to tackle some of those issues, but also address the fact that what is happening in those spaces speaks to a wider issue across society. And I think one thing that we could do, if I had the power in the world, is to invest more in other types of journalism, creating a body, for example. I think Jeremy, when we had a great manifesto in 2019, proposed ideas such as having a separate body that you're able to levy money from the big tech giants like Facebook and Twitter, and use that money to invest in local media, in investigative journalism, and that way you can kind of take some of that excessive wealth that is concentrated in those spaces and kind of distribute it, and you get better journalism that way. But I think it speaks to your wider issues. On the Labour Party, well, I wish that we would have stronger messaging when it comes to media reform. I think the easiest things the party can say is ending the political influence over the BBC, that no government at all should be able to hire its leadership. I think, the policies that we had in 2019, we should build on those, and that is not being, at all antagonistic towards the current leadership. It's saying that when it comes to supporting local news, and we've seen so many NUJ journalists in the West Midlands also go on strike from local press in the BBC and other local outlets, because they're not getting paid enough, their jobs are under threat, there are constant redundancies made in that area. So I think we need to invest in local journalism. We need to have effective press regulation, and that's what Leveson wanted hasn't happened. We need to have a Leveson standard regulation system. And then also wider reform of the way the media is owned. Like, I wish the Labour Party had those policies where you just couldn't, in other aspects, I guess in the finance sector, there's always kind of processes where if someone's trying to buy up another company, you check whether it's going to be a monopoly, and if it goes against the law. I don't know why that doesn't exist in the same way within the press, where you can just have billionaires owning huge chunks of the market. So I hope that the Labour Party would take on these ideas, because ultimately the British press know that fake news isn't something that's just happening on social media. It's also happening in our printed press. We saw also the threats with Channel 4's privatisation. While the government retracted on that, we know that these threats are constant, especially with a government that continues to go down this path of authoritarianism. And I think with Channel 4 we saw that quite vividly as well. So I think the party has an opportunity here to show whose side it's on, the same way it had an opportunity and still has an opportunity with the strikes to show which side it's on. I just constantly want it to be on the right side. And that's my job as a backbencher to kind of hope that will happen. Big up the West Midlands, first and foremost. So I think the question that you posed was, should trade unions have a kind of a role to play? Absolutely. I think we need to have trade union-owned papers. We have the Morning Star, of course, which is brilliant, but there are very few industrial relations journalists in this country. In terms of courses in our universities, I believe there were 2 last time I checked across our higher education sector, industrial relations being studied. And I think that speaks to the way our higher education system has been completely destroyed, but also the courses that universities deem are worthy to be promoted and to have students learn about. But I think the trade unions, there is a definite space there for them to take up a newspaper, and I think in the past that did exist. Obviously not in my living memory, but I think this is something that the unions, especially those that are progressive and left-wing, should be looking at, a free paper that they can support, that touches on the issues that we care about, so we can actually have some kind of breakthrough. I think also we should be looking at policies that democratize the current state of the press. I also believe that in the 2019 manifesto, Jeremy was talking about journalists electing their editors and having a process where they're democratically held accountable rather than just appointed. So I think that is also really important. On the Labour Party and good policy and how to make the leadership here, I think when Keir in his leadership race said that he wouldn't speak to the Sun, and he said that to an audience in Liverpool and then went on to speak into the Sun, I think speaks to a deep issue here where we need to play the game to get into power. And I obviously don't subscribe to that. I don't think the Sun, the Daily Mail, or any of those right-wing outlets will ever give me a good hearing. So I think my entire approach has been very different, where it's about trying to just be honest about what's going on, rather than trying to think that if I'm just nice and I throw some peace signs, maybe they'll write a nice thing about me. And that's not what's going to happen, because when you want to kind of challenge the system and you want to actually change society, then you're threatening those interests and you're threatening the status quo, so that will never happen. And I guess that is a calculation that politicians make. So any issues that you're experiencing, I think, is about people wanting to progress, and they believe that is a way that it will happen. But all of us in this room know that is not the way it works. So I can't speak for the leadership. I can only do what I know best, and try to operate within that. But using my platform, which I'm very lucky to have, to speak about these issues, hoping that others within the party are able to influence their MPs as members and use the structures within the party to move in a progressive direction, because otherwise I think things could become worse, if I'm honest. in terms of GPT, which I've not used, I have to say, I think that speaks to kind of, yeah, like you said, how technology is advancing, but we also have a world where there are deep fakes. How do you know a video that you're watching is a real video anymore, or pictures and so forth? And I think that is incredibly dangerous, and there needs to be a lot more regulation around those things. But I have to reflect on my visit to Brazil a couple of months ago ahead of Lula's incredible victory, narrow victory, but incredibly important victory, where conversations I was having there with activists and so forth, they said where they are when it comes to fake news, they're only 5-10 years ahead of us, where actually it becomes rampant unless you have structures in place to really challenge, and otherwise we're going to head down a route that we've seen perhaps in Brazil and in the US in terms of what is real anymore, in terms of audio, video and so forth. And we see that with the way things, I think, are shared on WhatsApp. I personally have lots of family who just share things, and before you know it, something that's completely not true is just shared so widely. So I think that's a question for everyone here. I don't have the answers to it, but how do we address these issues? And, you know, as, like you said, technology advances, these will become even more pertinent. And I think it does put kind of democracy and democratic credentials under scope quite significantly. As socialists, we have to keep believing that things will change and that our hopes for a better world, a more equitable world will be achieved. And often it's very hard to believe that that's possible, but then I reflect on everything that we have in society that we're proud of, even though the NHS is being destroyed before our very eyes. Just the fact that working class people were able to fight to achieve that, the workplace wins that we have with, the right to a weekend, maternity pay, sick pay, suffrage, women's suffrage, all of those things. In those moments where people were fighting for them, they perhaps didn't think that they were possible, but they carried on because even if they didn't see in their lifetime, they were doing it for the generations after them. So I think in politics, especially in Westminster, it's quite depressing because there's only a few voices that speak to our politics. But you also know that you're not speaking to the people in that room who are heckling you. You're speaking to everyone outside who's going to maybe listen to it on Twitter, on Facebook, or any other platform, and it's building that movement outside of these so-called corridors of power. It's using all of the kind of tools that we have and fighting back, because being in despair, it is something that the powerful and the elite want, because that protects them and the status quo. So we have to keep fighting, and that being hopeful and getting up and doing it every day is something that we have to be consciously thinking about, and we have to make an effort for, but we know that we're not in it alone. And I think that's where I guess our internationalist politics kicks in, because the work that we're doing here, there are people, fighting against fascists in India. There's those indigenous activists in the Amazon who are fighting and are winning back. So I think all of that gives us hope, because we've just got to carry on. The options are far worse if we don't. So I don't really think we've got a choice. We just have to get on with it.